The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl whisper, "Someone's inside," and his next move blew the rusted door apart. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a quiet evening when Jake Razor Morrison, a seasoned Hells Angels biker, rolled into the outskirts of the small town. The engine of his Harley-Davidson rumbled in the cold, lonely night air. It was the kind of night where everything seemed still, almost too still. As Jake passed the old, dilapidated house on the corner, something caught his attention. A faint, barely audible whisper reached his ears over the hum of his engine. "Someone's inside," the voice said. At first, Jake thought it was just the wind, or maybe the rustling of leaves. But then it came again, clearer this time. He slowed down, his instincts kicking in. A small voice, a little girl, calling out as if in fear. Without thinking, Jake turned off the engine and parked his bike by the side of the road. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He glanced at the house in front of him. The windows were dark, the house silent, but something felt off. The whisper came from inside, and it sent a chill down his spine. Despite the tough exterior and the fearsome reputation that came with his Hells Angels patch, Jake had a soft spot when it came to kids. He had seen enough hardship in his life to recognize when someone needed help. Without hesitating, he walked toward the house. The old wooden door was barely hanging on its hinges, and the rusty metal gate creaked as he pushed it open. As he stepped closer to the door, he heard the faint sound of movement inside. The girl's whisper was now joined by muffled sounds that made Jake's heart race. He cautiously reached for the handle, pushing the door open with one firm shove. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the silence. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of mildew and old wood filling his nostrils. His boots crunched on the floorboards as he moved inside, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The house was in shambles, with furniture overturned and walls covered in peeling paint. But amidst the chaos, Jake spotted her, a young girl, no older than 6 or 7, sitting on the floor in the corner, clutching a worn-out stuffed animal. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Are you the one who heard me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake kneeled down to her level, his tough exterior softening. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man like him. The girl hesitated for a moment before responding. "Emily." Her small hand reached out, and for a second, Jake wondered what kind of life she had been living to end up in such a place. As he looked around, he noticed the signs of neglect. Emily had clearly been alone here for some time, and the house, if it could even be called that, was no place for a child. "You don't have to be scared," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'm going to get you out of here." But as he reached out to help her up, the floor beneath them creaked, and the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. Jake's body went rigid, every muscle tensed. Someone was inside. Someone who had no business being here. He grabbed Emily and pulled her behind him, his protective instincts kicking in. He knew the only way out was to face whoever was lurking in the shadows. With one swift move, Jake slammed his shoulder against the rusted door, knocking it open. The house's secrets were now exposed. But what awaited him on the other side was a danger he never expected. Jake stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as the sound of footsteps grew louder from the shadows. His body tensed, every muscle preparing for a confrontation. Emily, her small hand gripping his jacket, pressed herself against his back, her breath shallow, fear evident in her wide eyes. Jake could feel her trembling, but he couldn't let that show. He had to keep it together for her. The footsteps stopped just behind him, and Jake could hear the faint rustling of clothes, the creak of a floorboard, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to move quietly. Jake's instincts screamed at him that this was no random encounter. The person following them knew exactly what they were doing. Without turning around, Jake spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Who's there?" There was no response, just the continued sound of movement. Jake clenched his fists, ready to act, when suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face half hidden by a thick beard and a hood pulled low over his brow. His eyes, dark and cold, locked onto Jake's. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Then the man spoke, his voice rough and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here." Jake's jaw tightened. He could feel Emily's small hand clutching his shirt, and it only made him more determined to protect her. He stepped forward, blocking her from the man's view, his stance wide and defensive. "I'm not leaving until she's safe," Jake said firmly, his voice unwavering. The man chuckled darkly, taking a step closer. "You don't get to make the rules here." Jake didn't move. He knew he had to be careful. The last thing he needed was a fight, especially with Emily so close. But he wasn't about to back down either. He glanced over his shoulder at Emily, whose face was pale with fear. The last thing he wanted was for her to witness more violence. But he knew she needed to understand that some people in this world were dangerous, and some fights could not be avoided. The man took another step closer, his eyes flicking over to the rusted door behind Jake. Jake followed the man's gaze, and in that instant, he realized what was happening. This wasn't just some random thug in the house. This was someone who had been waiting, someone who knew the secrets of this place. The man's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind howling outside. "You think you can just walk in here and take her?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "Who is she to you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, his eyes never leaving Jake. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man muttered, his voice growing more distant. Jake was about to move forward when Emily tugged at his jacket. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but full of surprising confidence for a child. "He's not going to hurt me. He's just scared." Jake looked down at her, his protective instincts flaring. He had no idea what kind of situation they were in, but Emily seemed calm. Too calm, almost. She wasn't just scared of the man, she was trying to comfort him. Jake's brow furrowed as he turned his attention back to the man, still standing in the shadows, his eyes gleaming. "You're protecting her, aren't you?" Jake asked, his voice softer now. The man didn't respond, but the tension in the air seemed to ease. For a moment, they just stood there, the only sounds the soft rustling of wine through the cracked windows. Jake knew that this wasn't over. The situation was far from resolved. There was something about this place, about this man, that didn't sit right with him. But for now, he had to focus on Emily. He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving the man, and said, "I'm taking her with me." Now, the man's expression hardened, and Jake saw the muscles in his arms tense, as if he was readying for a fight. Jake didn't wait for him to make a move. He grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her towards the door, the sound of footsteps following them, but growing fainter as they made their way through the old house. Emily squeezed Jake's hand, her small voice breaking the silence. "Thank you for helping me," she whispered, her words a soft breath in the cold air. Jake's heart clenched at the sound. He didn't know what kind of life she had been living, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. As they stepped out into the cold night, Jake looked around, making sure no one else was in sight. The storm was picking up, the wind howling through the trees. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know who this man was or what his connection to Emily was, but he knew that they weren't safe here. He had to get them out, and fast. As they walked toward the bike, the man's voice called out from behind them, "You don't understand. You can't just leave." Jake didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew one thing, whatever was waiting for them inside that house, it wasn't over yet. And he wasn't about to let Emily go through it alone. Jake could feel the tension in the air as they made their way to his bike. Emily's small hand was still clutching his jacket, her grip tight as she tried to stay close. Her eyes were wide, darting around, as though expecting something to jump out at them from the shadows. Jake scanned the street, making sure they were alone. The wind howled through the trees, and the storm had intensified, making everything feel colder, more dangerous. As they reached the bike, Jake glanced over his shoulder. The man from the house was still there, standing in the doorway, watching them with a dark, unreadable expression. Jake's gut told him that this wasn't the end of it. He helped Emily onto the back of the Harley, her small frame barely making an impact on the weight of the massive bike. She gripped his waist tightly, and he pulled his helmet over his head before starting the engine. The roar of the bike cut through the storm's howl, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He turned the throttle, and the bike shot forward, the wind and rain stinging his face as they sped away from the old house. Emily's small voice came from behind him, barely audible over the noise of the engine. "Are we safe now?" Jake wanted to reassure her, but the truth was, he wasn't sure. "We'll be safe as long as we keep moving," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty clawing at his insides. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that something wasn't right. They rode through the town, the streets empty and eerily quiet. The storm had driven everyone indoors. Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. The man in the house had been so familiar, but Jake couldn't place him. And Emily, the way she seemed to know everything about the house, about the man, it was too much to ignore. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Emily, how do you know about that house?" She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice small. "I used to live there with my mom and dad. But it was a long time ago." Jake's heart sank. He had a sinking feeling he was about to uncover a truth he wasn't ready for. They turned down a quiet road, the headlights of the Harley slicing through the storm. Jake knew he needed to get Emily to safety, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than she was letting on. He took a deep breath and pressed on the throttle, the bike speeding down the road. After a few more turns, they finally reached a small, rundown motel on the edge of town. Jake pulled the bike into the parking lot, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The motel looked deserted, but he didn't trust it. Not yet. He helped Emily off the bike, and they walked into the dimly lit lobby. The air inside smelled musty, and the floor creaked beneath their feet. The receptionist looked up from behind the counter, her tired eyes meeting Jake's. "I need a room," he said, his voice firm but calm. The receptionist nodded and handed him a key. "Room 8, she said, not asking any questions. Jake thanked her and led Emily down the hall. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the dim light flickered as they walked past empty rooms. When they reached room 8, Jake unlocked the door and ushered Emily inside. He locked the door behind them and set the suitcase down on the small table by the window. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, looking around at the unfamiliar surroundings. She seemed exhausted, but there was a tension in her body that hadn't gone away. Jake couldn't help but notice how quiet she was now. It was almost as if she was waiting for something. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than before. She nodded, but it was clear that something was bothering her. Jake sat down next to her on the bed, trying to figure out how to get through to her. He couldn't protect her from the past, but he could make sure she was safe now. "I don't know what's going on, but I promise you, I won't let anyone hurt you," he said, his voice firm. Emily looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with something Jake couldn't quite place. "I know," she whispered, "but you're not the one I'm afraid of." Jake's blood ran cold. He had a feeling. He knew exactly who she was talking about. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Jake's hand instinctively reached for the gun tucked in his waistband, his heart pounding. Emily's eyes went wide with fear. "Jake," she whispered, "it's him." Jake stood up, his body tense. He didn't know who was at the door, but he wasn't about to let anyone get past him. He glanced at Emily one last time before walking to the door and slowly, cautiously, opening it. The man from the house stood there, his dark eyes staring back at Jake with a mixture of anger and something else. Jake didn't know what to expect, but he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still on the handle as the man from the house stared at him with cold, calculating eyes. Emily's soft breath behind him was the only sound breaking the silence, but Jake could feel her tension building as the seconds passed. The man didn't move, but the air between them seemed to thicken, heavy with something unspoken. The chill from the storm outside crept into the room, and Jake's instincts told him that they were far from safe. He knew the man's presence wasn't a coincidence. His mind raced as he tried to read the man's expression, but it remained unreadable, like stone. "What do you want?" Jake's voice was calm, but inside, his heart was pounding. The man took a step forward, his boots scraping softly against the worn carpet. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice rough, like gravel scraping on concrete. "I'm here for her." Jake's stomach tightened. He knew what the man meant. He was talking about Emily. "You've got the wrong idea," Jake replied, his voice hardening. "I'm not leaving her with you." The man's gaze shifted to Emily, and for a moment, Jake saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of recognition, maybe regret, but it was gone before he could be sure. You don't understand, the man said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. She's not safe here. Not with you. Jake's anger flared. What's that supposed to mean? He moved to step closer to the man, but Emily's small hand gently touched his arm, stopping him. He turned to her, and for a brief moment, saw the fear in her eyes. It was more than just the man in front of them. It was something deeper, something about the situation that she wasn't telling him. Emily looked up at Jake, her voice barely above a whisper. I have to go with him. Jake's breath caught in his throat, and his heart sank. What? He asked, unable to keep the shock from his voice. No, you're not going anywhere with him. But Emily's small hand gripped his sleeve tighter. Please, she said softly, he's my father. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He could hardly believe it. The man standing in front of him, the one he had assumed was a stranger, was Emily's father. The truth crashed over him, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. The man's expression softened as he stepped closer to Emily, his hand reaching out. Emily, he said, his voice trembling now. I didn't want you to grow up like this. I didn't want to leave you. Jake's mind raced. Everything he thought he knew about this situation had just changed. But there was still so much that didn't make sense. If this man was truly her father, why had he abandoned her? Why had she been living alone in that dilapidated house, hiding in the shadows? Why didn't you come back for her? Jake asked, his voice low, but full of anger and disbelief. The man looked down, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. I couldn't, he whispered. I made too many mistakes. Jake stared at him, not knowing what to say. Emily was right. There was something about this man's presence that scared her. But there was something else, something deeper, that made her want to go with him. Jake felt a surge of protectiveness toward her. He couldn't let this man, no matter who he was, take her away. I don't trust you, Jake said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. You're not taking her anywhere. The man's eyes hardened again, and for a brief moment, Jake thought he saw a flash of the same coldness he'd felt back in the house. But then, just as quickly, the man's gaze softened. I'm not here to take her, he said quietly. I'm here to fix things. I know I've failed her, but I won't leave her. Like this. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest as he processed the words. Was this man truly trying to make amends? Was there a chance that he could protect Emily? Or was he just another danger to her well-being? Jake didn't know, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this man control the situation. Emily stepped forward, her voice small but determined. I have to go with him, Jake. I have to. Jake looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was a quiet, painful resolve. She wanted to go with him. But that didn't mean Jake had to agree. I'm not leaving you with him, Jake said firmly, but Emily shook her head. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm not safe here. He's the only one who can keep me safe. Jake stood there, torn between his instinct to protect her and the undeniable truth that this man was her father, and maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. But Jake wasn't ready to trust him yet. Not until he understood more. I'll come with you, Jake said slowly, his voice filled with uncertainty. But I'm not letting you out of my sight. The man nodded, his expression still unreadable, but something in his eyes told Jake that he was telling the truth. For Emily's sake, Jake had to trust him, for now. But he knew this was just the beginning. Jake's mind was racing as he watched the man, who had claimed to be Emily's father, step back from the door. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him. Every instinct told him to protect Emily, to keep her away from this man. But there was something in Emily's eyes that made him pause. She trusted him, and that was a feeling Jake hadn't been able to ignore since the moment he'd met her. They stood there for a moment, neither of them saying anything. Emily's hand was still gripping Jake's sleeve, but her fingers were no longer trembling. She looked up at him, her small face filled with a quiet determination that made Jake's heart ache. I don't know if I can trust him, but I'll follow you wherever you go, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind outside. Jake looked down at her, feeling a wave of protectiveness sweep over him. He didn't know what had happened between her and this man, but he wasn't about to let her walk into something dangerous. Not on his watch. The man's expression softened, but Jake could see the tension still coiled in his shoulders. I know I don't deserve her trust, the man said, his voice low. But I'm not here to hurt her. I never was. I made mistakes, and I've paid for them. Jake didn't respond right away. He was still processing the sudden shift in this situation. One minute, he was trying to get Emily to safety, and the next, he was standing in front of her estranged father, someone who clearly had a complicated history with her. It wasn't like Jake had never made mistakes. He had his own past, one full of regret and choices he wished he could undo. But he wasn't about to let that cloud his judgment now. Emily needed him, and he wasn't going to let anyone take her from him, no matter who they were. "I'm not leaving you alone with him," Jake said, his voice firm. "Not until I know you're safe." The man nodded, a small but meaningful gesture. "Fair enough," he said. "But you have to understand. She's the reason I'm here. I don't want to drag her back into something she doesn't need, but I need to explain things to her. She deserves to know the truth." Jake studied him for a moment, trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. There was something in the way the man spoke that made him think he wasn't lying, but there was still so much Jake didn't know. He glanced at Emily again, her face pale, but her eyes steady. "Let's talk," Jake said finally. "But not here. We need to get out of the open. We don't know who else might be watching." The man agreed, and they all moved toward the small motel room, the tension thick in the air between them. Once inside, Jake locked the door behind them and turned to face the man. Emily sat down on the bed, her eyes darting between the two men. "Okay," Jake said, "start talking. What do I need to know?" The man took a deep breath before speaking, his voice quieter now, like he was trying to gather the strength to say what had been left unsaid for so long. "Her mother and I, we weren't good together. We fought, and I wasn't around when she needed me the most. I did some things I'm not proud of, and I made promises I couldn't keep. I should have been there for her, for Emily. But I wasn't." The man paused, looking down at his hands as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. "I left her," he continued, "and I've regretted it every single day since. But I couldn't fix it. Not back then." Jake's eyes narrowed as he processed what the man had said. "So, you just disappeared?" he asked. The man nodded slowly. "Yeah, I thought I was protecting her by staying away, but all I did was hurt her more. I was trying to protect myself, too. I couldn't face the damage I had done." There was a long silence. Emily was still sitting on the bed, her legs crossed underneath her, staring at the man like she was trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. Jake looked at her, then at the man. "And now," he asked. "Now, I need to fix it," the man said, his voice full of determination. "I don't expect her to forgive me, but I'm not going to let her live in fear anymore. I've heard about what's been happening to her, the people she's been running from. I'm here to help." Emily's voice broke the silence. "You don't have to help me," she whispered, her voice small and fragile. "I'm fine." Jake turned to her, his heart aching at the pain in her eyes. He wanted to believe that she was fine, that she didn't need anyone else to take care of her. But he knew better. Emily had been through things that no child should ever have to face, and Jake wasn't about to let that continue. The man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he said quietly, "but I'm not running away this time. I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep you safe, Emily." Jake looked at the man, his mind still racing. He had heard what the man had said, but there were still so many questions, so many things that didn't add up. He wasn't sure he could trust him fully, but he knew he couldn't do this alone. If Emily was going to be safe, they were going to have to work together, even if it meant facing their pasts. "All right," Jake said finally. "We'll figure this out. But you stay in the background. You stay out of her way unless she asks for you." The man nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Jake turned to Emily, who was looking at the man, still unsure of what to feel. "You don't have to talk to him if you don't want to," Jake said gently. "You're in control here." Emily nodded slowly, but the uncertainty in her eyes lingered. Jake didn't know what was going to happen next, but he was certain of one thing. This wasn't over yet. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, his hands running through his hair as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Emily was curled up beside him, her small body shaking with the weight of everything she'd been through. The man, who had claimed to be her father, was sitting in the corner, his eyes downcast. Jake still wasn't sure how to feel about him. He'd said all the right things, but words were easy. Trust had to be earned. It wasn't just about what the man had done in the past. It was about what he would do now. Jake turned his attention back to Emily. She had been so brave, so strong, but there was only so much a child could carry. She had seen things no child should ever have to see. The fact that she'd been left alone, hidden away in that house, made Jake's blood boil. He glanced at her again, wondering how much of her pain she was hiding. She hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived at the motel, and Jake knew that was because she didn't have the words to explain it. Jake had spent a lifetime running from his past. His days in the Hells Angels had taught him how to hide his emotions, how to shut down and ignore the things that haunted him. But Emily couldn't do that. She was too young, too innocent. She still believed in things that Jake had long ago given up on. She believed in family. She believed in the idea that people could change. Jake didn't know if he could ever believe in that again. The man had broken Emily's trust once, and Jake wasn't sure he could let him get close enough to break it again. He stood up from the bed, the floor creaking beneath him, and walked over to the window. The storm had passed, but the night was still thick with tension. He could see the faint glow of the motel's neon sign, the wind pushing the palm trees back and forth. It was peaceful, in a way, but everything inside him felt on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He didn't know what it was, but his instincts had never failed him before. And right now, they were screaming at him to be ready. Jake! Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to face her. She was sitting up on the bed, her eyes wide. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked quietly. Jake's heart ached as he walked back to her. He sat down beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Emily looked up at him, her face full of confusion. "But what about him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is he really my father?" Jake hesitated. He didn't want to lie to her, but he didn't want to tell her the truth until he was sure. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice low. "But I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Not again." Emily nodded slowly, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. Jake knew that the journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. He had no idea what kind of man this so-called father really was, but Jake wasn't about to let him have any control over Emily's life. He was already too late in protecting her from the things she had been through. Jake stood up and walked over to the door. The man was still sitting in the corner, his posture tense, but still watching them. Jake's eyes met his, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "You're going to tell me everything," Jake said, his voice cold and firm. "Why you disappeared, why you left her, and what your intentions are now." The man didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "And I'll tell you everything." Jake crossed his arms, watching the man carefully. "You better." The man looked down at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "I never wanted to leave her," he began, his voice thick with regret. "But I wasn't in a place where I could take care of her. I thought it was better if she stayed with her mother. I thought I was doing the right thing." Jake clenched his jaw. "And then what?" he asked. "You just disappeared?" The man nodded. "I made some bad choices. I was running from my own problems, my own demons. And I thought I could protect her by staying away. But I couldn't." Jake's hands tightened into fists at his sides. "So now you show up? After all this time?" The man's eyes met Jake's. "I've been trying to fix my life," he said quietly. "And I want to fix the damage I've done. If Emily will let me, I want to be a part of her life again. I want to protect her." Jake didn't know what to make of the man's words. He had no idea if they were sincere or just another attempt to manipulate him. But he had to admit, the man sounded different now. He sounded like someone who had been through a lot. Someone who was trying to make things right. But the question was, could he? "We'll see," Jake said, his voice still wary. He turned back to Emily, who was still sitting on the bed, her small face full of uncertainty. He walked over to her, crouching down so that they were eye to eye. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Jake said softly. "I promise." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "I know," she whispered, "but I'm scared." Jake's heart broke for her. She had every right to be scared, and he couldn't promise her that everything was going to be okay. But he could promise that he would be there, that he would keep fighting for her. He took her hand and squeezed it gently. "We'll figure this out together," he said. Emily nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Jake wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything tear them apart. The night was still, the air thick with the promise of something more. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on Emily as she sat beside him, her small form curled tightly into the blankets. He had been watching her for hours, waiting for her to speak, but she remained quiet, her thoughts clearly running deep. The motel room was eerily silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Jake had been hoping for a moment of peace, a breath of calm after everything they had been through, but it never seemed to come. He had promised her that he would keep her safe, but he knew the danger wasn't over yet. There was still the man, her father, and Jake had no idea how to handle him. "Jake," Emily whispered, breaking the silence. Her voice was small, fragile, and it tugged at Jake's heart. He turned to her, his eyes softening. "What is it, Emily?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with something Jake couldn't quite place. "Fear? Hope? A mix of both? Is he really my father?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He hadn't been sure of that himself, but he knew he couldn't lie to her. "I don't know, Emily," he said quietly, "but he says he is. And right now, that's all we have to go on." Emily's small face crumpled, and she looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know if I can believe him," she whispered. "He left me." Jake's heart broke for her, but he knew she was right. She had every reason to doubt him, every reason to feel betrayed. "I understand," Jake said softly, "but I'm not going to let him hurt you again. Not if I can help it." Emily sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, and Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm here for you," he said gently. "I'll always be here, no matter what." She nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. It wasn't easy to trust anyone after everything she had been through. But Jake would do whatever it took to make sure she knew she wasn't alone. They sat in silence for a moment, and Jake felt the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but he couldn't bear the thought of Emily going through it alone. He had made a promise to her, and he wasn't going to break it. Finally, the man, her father, spoke, his voice low from the corner of the room. "She deserves to know the truth," he said, breaking the silence. Jake turned his attention to him. The man was still sitting in the corner, his face shadowed by the dim light. He hadn't moved much since their last conversation, but Jake could feel the tension in the room. Emily's father didn't look like the man who had abandoned her. He looked like someone who had been through hell, someone who was carrying the weight of the past on his shoulders. Jake studied him, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed. "What truth?" Jake asked, his voice low and cautious. "The truth about what happened," the man replied. "About why I left. Why I wasn't there when she needed me the most." Jake took a deep breath, his patience starting to wear thin. "You've got 5 minutes," he said firmly. "And then we're done. I don't have time for your excuses." The man nodded, his face darkening as if he had expected Jake's response. "I understand," he said quietly, "but you need to hear it. You need to know the full story." He paused, taking a deep breath, and then began to speak. "I didn't want to leave," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But I was caught up in things I couldn't control, things I thought I could outrun. I was involved with people, bad people, and they told me I had to go. They threatened Emily." Jake's jaw tightened at the mention of threats. He stepped closer to the man, his eyes hard. "What kind of people?" he demanded. The man shook his head, as if the memory was too painful to relive. "I don't want to talk about it," he said softly, "but I didn't have a choice. I thought if I left, they wouldn't hurt her. I thought it was the only way to keep her safe." Jake felt a rush of anger. "You think abandoning her was keeping her safe?" he asked, his voice rising. "You think disappearing was the answer?" The man looked at Jake, his eyes filled with pain. "I thought it was," he said quietly. "But I was wrong. I should have stayed. I should have fought for her. I should have protected her." Jake stared at him, trying to process the man's words. "And now you expect me to just trust you?" Jake asked. "After everything you've put her through?" The man's eyes dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said quietly. "I don't deserve it. But I'm asking for a chance to make it right." Jake's mind was spinning. He had never been good at trusting people, especially after everything he had seen in the past. He had seen too many people break promises, too many people betray each other. But this was different. Emily was different. He couldn't protect her from everything, but he could help her heal. He could make sure she didn't have to face this alone. Jake sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice softening. "But I'll keep her safe. I'll protect her." The man looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Jake stood up and walked to the door. He needed time to think, time to figure out what to do next. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Emily go through this alone. He couldn't. He would protect her, no matter what. Jake sat by the small, dimly lit window of the motel room, his eyes fixed on the rain pouring down outside. The storm had passed, but the weight of everything still hung heavy in the air. Emily was in the corner, quietly drawing on a piece of paper she had found in her bag. She hadn't said much since the conversation with her father, and Jake couldn't blame her. He didn't know what to feel either. The man, Emily's father, had left them in an uncomfortable silence as he sat across the room, his face tense, waiting for Jake to say something. But Jake had nothing to say, nothing that would make this right. He was still trying to process everything. The fact that Emily's father had been a part of her life and had left her, and now, after all these years, he was back. Jake didn't trust him. He couldn't. But Emily was scared, and that was all that mattered right now. Jake had promised to protect her, and that promise hadn't changed. He turned to face her, his voice soft. "You okay?" Emily didn't look up from her drawing, but her pencil paused for a moment. "I don't know," she whispered. "It's a lot to think about." Jake nodded, walking over and sitting next to her. He didn't know what the right words were either, but he was here for her, no matter what. "You don't have to talk about it right now," he said gently. Emily nodded, her eyes looking down at the paper in front of her. It was a drawing of a tree, the leaves falling off in delicate strokes. "I don't want to leave you," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Jake's heart sank. "You're not leaving me, Emily," he reassured her, his voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here." She looked up at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. "But what if he's right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I'm supposed to go with him?" Jake took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. He had no idea what was right for Emily. He didn't even know if the man who claimed to be her father was telling the truth. All he knew was that he couldn't let Emily face this alone. "I'm not saying you have to decide anything right now," Jake said gently. "You don't have to choose him over me. I'll be here for you no matter what." Emily's eyes searched his face, trying to find something she could hold on to, some reassurance that everything would be okay. Jake wanted to promise her that everything would be all right, but he couldn't. He didn't know how this was going to end. "I just want you to be safe," Jake said quietly. "That's all that matters to me." She nodded slowly, as if trying to convince herself. "I don't know if I can trust him," she whispered. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Jake felt a pang in his chest. He understood. He had been there before, in the darkest places, when trust was nothing more than a fragile memory. He knew how hard it was to let people in, to let them help. But Emily wasn't alone anymore. Not while he was here. "You don't have to trust him right now," Jake said softly. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." Emily didn't say anything, but she leaned against Jake, her small body seeking comfort in the only person who had never let her down. Jake wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. He couldn't change the past, and he couldn't take away her fear. But he could be there. He could make sure she didn't have to face it alone. Outside, the rain continued to fall, the sound of it pounding against the windows almost comforting in its rhythm. Jake's thoughts drifted to the man in the corner. He had been watching them quietly, his eyes filled with something that looked like guilt, but Jake wasn't sure he could trust that. He wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. Emily's father had made his choices, and those choices had consequences. Jake had made his own choices, too, and those choices had brought him here. To this motel room. To this broken, scared little girl who had somehow become the most important thing in his life. He had failed before. He had walked away from people who needed him. But not this time. Not with Emily. He wasn't going to let her down. The man in the corner shifted slightly, as if he was about to speak, but Jake cut him off before he could. "We're not having this conversation right now," Jake said, his voice low and firm. "Not tonight." The man nodded, and for once, Jake saw a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. The silence in the room grew heavy again, but Jake didn't mind. He would protect Emily, no matter what it took. The night stretched on, and as the hours passed, Jake couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Would Emily's father prove himself? Or would he be another person to disappoint her? Jake didn't know. But whatever happened, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere. The night dragged on, the silence stretching longer than either Jake or Emily was comfortable with. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping his knees as his mind churned with thoughts of the man in the corner. Emily had fallen asleep hours ago, her small body curled up in a blanket, but Jake couldn't sleep. He had too many questions, too many doubts, and the tension in the air felt thick, like the calm before a storm. The man, Emily's father, was still awake, though. His figure loomed in the corner, his head bowed as though lost in thought. For a moment, Jake considered speaking to him, but the words felt like they would choke him. The man had already said so much, but there was so much more left unsaid. Every fiber in Jake's body told him to stay on guard. He had no intention of letting his guard down, not with everything that was at stake. He couldn't let Emily down. His promise to her still echoed in his mind. He would protect her, no matter what. The man's voice broke the stillness. "You should talk to her," he said quietly, his tone low but steady. Jake turned to face him, his jaw tightening. "About what?" The man raised his head slowly, meeting Jake's gaze. "She needs to understand," he said, his voice thick with regret. "She deserves to know the truth." Jake's patience was wearing thin. "I'm not sure you're the one to tell her that," he replied, his voice cold. "She's been through enough already. She doesn't need any more confusion." The man seemed to deflate at Jake's words. "I know," he said softly. "I failed her. I know I can't fix the past, but I can try to make it right." Jake stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "Making it right doesn't always mean you get a second chance," he said, his voice hard. The man's shoulders sagged, but he didn't back down. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I can't just walk away again. Not this time." Jake didn't know what to make of him. Part of him wanted to believe the man, wanted to believe that he had changed, but there was still too much that didn't add up. Too many unanswered questions. He turned away, his mind racing. He needed a moment to think, to process everything. "What exactly do you want from me?" Jake finally asked, his voice low. "You want me to trust you?" The man didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, his eyes flicking toward Emily, still asleep on the bed. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said quietly. "I'm just asking for a chance." For her. Jake didn't speak for a moment, his gaze fixed on the man. He could see the sincerity in his eyes, but sincerity wasn't enough. Jake had seen too many people betray that trust, too many people make promises they couldn't keep. He wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. But he also wasn't sure he had the right to keep Emily from knowing the truth. "I don't know if I can give you a chance," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll give her a chance. I won't keep her from you. But you better prove that you're worthy of her trust. Because if you hurt her again, I'll make sure you never get close to her." The man's eyes flashed with something that could have been fear, but also determination. "I won't hurt her again," he said, his voice steady. "I swear on my life, I won't." Jake's gaze softened just a fraction, but he didn't fully let his guard down. He couldn't afford to. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him, and he knew that no matter what, he had to keep Emily safe. She was his responsibility now. "You can stay here," Jake said, his voice firm. "But you stay away from her until she's ready. Don't push her. She's been through enough." The man nodded, his face a mixture of gratitude and regret. "I understand," he said quietly. Jake didn't know if the man truly understood, but he wasn't going to argue. They were running out of time, and Jake knew that whatever happened next, it was going to change everything. He turned toward Emily, his heart aching as he watched her sleep. She had been through so much, and yet she was still just a child. He could only imagine the fear that ran through her, the uncertainty about who to trust. He wanted to shield her from all of it, but he knew that wasn't possible. She was going to have to face it, whether she was ready or not. He walked over to her, kneeling beside the bed, and brushed a lock of hair away from her face. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Jake's heart tightened as he looked at her, his love for her deeper than anything he had ever felt before. She wasn't just someone he had promised to protect. She was family now, and no matter what, Jake wasn't going to let anything take her from him. As he stood up and walked toward the window again, the night seemed even quieter than before. The storm outside now nothing more than a memory. But the tension in the room was thick, and Jake could feel it in his bones. Tomorrow was a new day, but Jake knew it would bring more challenges, more uncertainty. He wasn't sure what would happen with Emily's father, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The morning came too soon. Jake had barely slept, his mind running 1,000 miles a minute. He had promised Emily that he would keep her safe, but that promise was beginning to feel heavier with each passing hour. The man in the corner, her father, had been silent for most of the night, the weight of his own regrets hanging in the air. Jake could feel the tension thick in the room, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to give. Emily had woken up early, long before the sun fully rose, and was sitting by the window, staring out at the empty street. She was quiet, which was both good and bad. She needed time to process everything, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was weighing on her more than anything. He stood up, stretched, and walked over to her. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice gentle. Emily didn't immediately respond. She just stared out the window, her fingers picking at the edge of the blanket in her lap. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke. "I don't know what to think anymore," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can trust him." Jake sat down beside her, his eyes focused on her small, fragile frame. He could feel her struggle, feel the weight of everything she had been through, and he hated it. He hated that she was so young and had to deal with all this. "You don't have to trust him right now," Jake said gently, his voice reassuring. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. I'm here for you, Emily. I'm not going anywhere." Emily's eyes flicked up to him, and for the first time that morning, a faint spark of relief appeared in her gaze. She nodded, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "But what if he's telling the truth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he really does want to? Make it right?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had asked himself that same question 100 times. He didn't know the answer. He didn't know if the man who claimed to be her father had really changed, or if he was just another threat, another liar. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "But what I do know is that no one is going to hurt you again. Not if I can help it." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You're always here for me, aren't you?" she asked. "Always." Jake smiled, though it felt bittersweet. "Always," he said, his voice firm. Emily seemed to draw some comfort from his words, but Jake could see the wariness still lurking in her eyes. It wasn't going to be easy for her to let go of the fear, the doubt. And it wasn't going to be easy for Jake to trust her father, either. But he had made a promise to Emily, and he was going to keep it. "You don't have to talk to him yet," Jake said, standing up. "You don't have to do anything until you're ready." Emily nodded but didn't say anything. She wasn't ready, Jake could tell. And that was fine. He wasn't about to push her. She had been through too much already. Jake turned and walked toward the door, his mind still racing. There were too many unknowns, too many things that didn't make sense. The man had his own story, but Jake wasn't sure it was one that he could believe. He still wasn't sure if Emily's father was someone he could trust. And that uncertainty was gnawing at him, making it impossible to focus. But he couldn't let that stop him. He had to protect Emily. He had to figure out who he could trust, who could be a part of her life, and who was just a danger waiting to happen. He opened the door to the small motel room and stepped out into the cool morning air. The street was still empty, the town still asleep. The quiet was almost eerie, but it gave Jake a moment of peace, a moment to collect his thoughts. He needed a plan. He needed to figure out how to deal with the man who had shown up unannounced in their lives. Emily's father, the one who had left her behind, the one who had caused so much pain, and now, after all these years, was back to make things right. But Jake wasn't sure he could just forgive and forget. Not after everything. He wasn't ready to hand Emily over to him, not without knowing what kind of man he really was. As he stood there, deep in thought, the sound of footsteps behind him made Jake turn. The man was standing at the door of the motel room, looking out at the street. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his back to Jake. Jake didn't say anything either, but the tension was palpable. Finally, the man spoke. "She doesn't trust me," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. Jake didn't respond immediately, but his mind was working, piecing together everything the man had said. Was he truly trying to make things right, or was this just another act? "You can't expect her to just trust you," Jake said finally. "You left her. You left her alone. And now you expect her to come running back." The man turned around slowly, his eyes meeting Jake's. "I don't expect anything," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve her trust. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. I won't leave her again." Jake studied him, his eyes narrowing. The man's words were heavy, but Jake couldn't decide if they were genuine or just another lie. He had heard too many empty promises in his life to believe them easily. "You'd better prove that," Jake said, his voice low. "Because if you hurt her again, I'll make sure you never get near her." The man didn't flinch. He just nodded, a look of determination in his eyes. "I'll prove it," he said, his voice steady. Jake didn't know if he believed him, but he didn't have much of a choice. For now, he had to keep his promise to Emily. He had to make sure she was safe. And he couldn't do that alone. Jake stood in the doorway, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a storm cloud ready to burst. He hadn't slept, not really. The uncertainty, the tension, and the looming question of whether or not he could trust Emily's father still weighed on him. He had made promises. To Emily. To himself. But the path forward was blurred, and Jake wasn't sure what the right choice was. Emily was still inside, her small face hidden behind the curtain, watching the street as if waiting for something to happen. She was so quiet now, so lost in her thoughts. Jake could feel her fear, her hesitation, and he hated it. She shouldn't have to feel this way. Not anymore. Not after everything she had already been through. The man, her father, was still inside, pacing in silence, his mind clearly elsewhere. Jake couldn't figure him out. Every word the man spoke sounded sincere, but Jake had learned long ago not to take words at face value. There were too many people in his past who had promised him the world and then vanished. But Emily wasn't like him. She was different. She deserved better. And Jake wasn't going to let her down. The sound of footsteps broke Jake's thoughts, and he turned to see Emily standing behind him, her eyes wide and filled with a quiet determination. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I think I need to talk to him." Jake's heart sank at the words. He had hoped she wouldn't feel the need to go back to him, not yet. But this was her choice, and he wasn't going to stop her. "You sure?" Jake asked, his voice heavy with concern. Emily nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I don't know if I can trust him," she said, her voice cracking. "But I need to know. I need to understand why he left. Why he disappeared." Jake studied her for a long moment, trying to gauge what she was feeling, what she was thinking. He wanted to protect her, to keep her away from the pain that might come with facing her father. But he also knew that this was something she needed to do for herself. "Okay," Jake said, his voice soft but firm. "But you don't have to do this alone. I'll be right here. You don't have to talk to him if you're not ready." Emily didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, looking at him with those eyes full of unspoken fear and hope. And then she stepped forward, slowly, like she was gathering every ounce of courage she had left. Jake stepped aside to let her pass, his heart aching for her. She was so young, too young to carry the weight of these unanswered questions. He wished he could make it all go away, take away the hurt and the confusion. But he couldn't. He could only be there for her. Emily walked into the room, her steps hesitant but determined. The man, her father, was standing near the window, looking out at the street. He turned when he heard her footsteps, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and longing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension, the silence pressing down like an unspoken question. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back?" The man's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Jake could see the pain in them. He looked down, running a hand through his hair before speaking. "I thought it was better for you," he said quietly. "I thought you'd be safer if I stayed away. I wasn't in a place where I could protect you. I was lost. I didn't want you to see that." Emily shook her head, her voice rising with emotion. "You think staying away made me safer? You think I was better off alone?" Her voice cracked, the weight of all the years without him finally breaking through. The man stepped forward, his hands reaching out, but Emily pulled back. "No," she whispered, stepping away from him. "I don't want your apologies. I just want to know why." Jake stood in the doorway, watching the exchange, his heart torn. He couldn't protect her from the hurt of this moment, but he could be there for her. He could make sure she didn't have to face this alone. The man's voice broke the silence again, softer this time. "I was wrong," he said, his voice full of regret. "I should have come back. I should have fought for you. But I didn't know how. I was afraid. Afraid of what I had become." Emily's expression softened, just a little, but she didn't step forward. She didn't reach for him. Instead, she looked down, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve as if she was trying to keep herself together. "You don't get to be afraid anymore," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "I don't need your fear. I needed you. And you weren't there." The man stepped back as if the weight of her words had struck him harder than anything he had expected. He didn't try to reach for her again. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I can't change the past, but I'll do everything I can to make it right. If you'll let me." Emily stood there for a moment, her small body trembling, but she didn't say anything. Jake could see the battle in her eyes, the pull between what she wanted and what she had been taught. She was trying to find a way to forgive him, but it wasn't easy. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can." Jake stepped forward, standing beside her. "You don't have to make that decision right now," he said softly. "We can take it one step at a time. But we're in this together. I'm not going anywhere." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a small spark of hope. For the first time in a long while, she didn't look so alone. Jake wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would be there for her, every step of the way. The days began to blend together in the quiet motel room. Emily had said little since her conversation with her father, and Jake knew she was still processing everything. She had been through too much in her young life to be able to heal quickly, and Jake wasn't going to rush her. But there was a lingering fear in the air, a fear that neither of them could shake. Emily's father, though seemingly sincere, had been absent for too long. Jake still didn't know if he could trust him, but he wasn't about to let Emily down. Not now. Not ever. The storm outside had passed, but the tension inside the room remained thick. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the empty street, his thoughts turning over the same questions he had been asking since the moment they arrived. Who could he trust? What was the man's true motive? Was he here to make amends? Or was this just another ploy to get close to Emily? As Jake stood there, lost in thought, the door creaked open behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. He could feel the presence in the room. It was Emily's father. He stepped into the room quietly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between them. Jake didn't acknowledge him right away. He couldn't. There was too much at stake. Finally, the man spoke. "Jake," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I need to talk to you." Jake remained silent, his back still to the man. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "I know you don't trust me," the man continued, his voice steady but with a hint of weariness. "And I don't expect you to. But I need you to understand something. I'm not here to hurt her. I'm not here to take her away. I'm just trying to make things right." Jake finally turned to face him. "Make things right," Jake echoed, his voice low, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just waltz back into her life after all this time, and everything will be okay? She's been through hell, and you weren't there for her. You can't just undo that with a few words." The man winced at Jake's words, but he didn't back down. "I know," he said quietly. "I can't undo the past, but I can make sure she doesn't have to face the future alone." Jake didn't know how to respond. He had heard the man's story. He had listened to the regret in his voice. But words were just words. They didn't change the reality of the situation. Jake's eyes shifted to Emily, sitting quietly on the bed. She hadn't said anything since her father entered the room, and Jake could feel the uncertainty radiating from her. She didn't know if she could trust him, and Jake didn't blame her. She had every right to be cautious. "She doesn't need you," Jake said, his voice firm. "She needs me. She needs someone who's been here, who's been with her through the tough times. She doesn't need someone who abandoned her when she was just a kid." The man's shoulders slumped, but he didn't argue. He knew Jake was right. "I'm not asking you to be her father," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want her to know that I'm here, that I'm sorry." Jake's heart clenched as he looked at the man. There was sincerity in his eyes, but Jake wasn't sure it was enough. He couldn't just let Emily make this decision without understanding the full picture. She needed time. And Jake needed time, too. "You've got to prove yourself," Jake said finally, his voice hard. "You can't expect her to just forget everything and trust you. It's not that simple." The man nodded, his expression resigned. "I know," he said softly. "I know it's not that simple. But I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I can be there for her, that I can protect her. She deserves that." Jake studied him for a long moment, weighing his words, his actions, everything about the man. He didn't know if he believed him, but for Emily's sake, he was willing to give him a chance. But that didn't mean he was ready to let his guard down. "Not yet. You stay in the background for now," Jake said, his voice firm. "Let her come to you when she's ready. But you don't push her. Not again." The man nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and gratitude. "I understand," he said quietly. Jake turned his attention to Emily, who was still sitting quietly on the bed, her eyes lost in thought. He walked over to her, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Jake said softly. "You don't have to talk to him if you're not ready." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do, Jake," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can trust him. I don't know if I even want to." Jake took a deep breath, his heart aching for her. He wished he could take away the pain, take away the confusion, but he knew he couldn't. All he could do was be there for her. "You don't have to make that decision today," Jake said gently. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." Emily nodded slowly, her gaze shifting back to her father, who was still standing in the corner. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. Jake stayed by her side, not saying anything more. He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Emily face this alone. Not now. Not ever. Days passed in a blur, each one filled with quiet moments and quiet conversations. Emily had spent more time with her father, but Jake still kept his distance. He had promised to protect her, and he kept a watchful eye over everything. The man, who had once abandoned his daughter, was trying. Jake couldn't deny that. He could see the regret in his eyes every time Emily spoke to him, and Jake knew that he wanted to make things right. But he also knew that actions spoke louder than words. The past couldn't be undone, no matter how many times the man apologized. But Emily needed to make her own choices. And Jake wasn't about to take that from her. She needed to heal, to figure out where she fit in this new reality. It wasn't going to be easy, and Jake knew that. He had seen the scars people carried, both physical and emotional. He had them too, but he couldn't do this for her. All he could do was give her the time she needed. One evening, after another long, quiet day, Emily came to Jake. She had been quieter than usual, lost in her thoughts, her mind a maze of emotions she didn't know how to handle. She stood in the doorway of the small motel room, her face expressionless, but Jake could see the storm in her eyes. "Jake," she said softly, "I need to talk to you." He stood up immediately, his heart skipping a beat. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily stepped into the room, her hands clasped in front of her as she slowly walked toward him. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she said, her voice steady but filled with a hint of hesitation. "About my dad. About you." Jake's heart sank. He knew this was coming. He had been expecting it. He had been waiting for Emily to make sense of her feelings, to decide what she wanted. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his voice soft. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and clarity. "I don't know if I can forgive him," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I also don't want him to leave again. I don't want to be alone." Jake stepped forward, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You don't have to forgive him if you're not ready," he said gently. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. But you're not alone, Emily. I'm here, and I always will be." Emily nodded, a faint tear slipping down her cheek. "I just want to be okay," she whispered. "I just want to feel like things can be normal again." Jake smiled, his heart aching for her. "We'll get there," he said, "one step at a time." Emily wiped her tear away and took a deep breath. "I think I need to talk to him. Really talk to him. To understand. But I'm scared. I don't know if I'm ready." Jake nodded, his expression softening. "I think that's a good idea," he said. "But take it at your own pace. You don't have to rush. Whatever you decide, I'm here. I'll be right by your side." Emily smiled faintly, the first smile Jake had seen in days. It was small, but it was real. "Thank you, Jake," she whispered. Jake's chest tightened at the words. She didn't need to say anything more. He knew what she meant. She was starting to trust him again, and that meant more than anything. "You're welcome," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. As Emily left the room, heading toward her father's room, Jake sat down on the bed, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that Emily was strong. She would find her way, and he would be there to support her every step of the way. As he looked out the window at the fading sunlight, Jake's thoughts turned to the man who had been absent for so long. He still didn't trust him completely, but he understood something now. People could change. Maybe not all the time, but sometimes. And Emily needed to decide whether or not she was ready to take that chance. Jake wasn't going to stop her. He couldn't. This was her journey, and he was just here to help guide her through it. As the evening wore on, Emily returned to the room, her face a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She didn't say anything at first, but Jake could see it in her eyes. She had taken the first step, and that was enough. I talked to him, she said quietly, sitting down next to Jake. I didn't forgive him, but I told him how I felt, and I think that's a start. Jake nodded, his heart swelling with pride. You did the right thing, he said gently. It's going to take time, but you'll get there. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet hope. Maybe we both will, she whispered. Jake smiled, his heart full. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew there were still tough times ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right path. Emily was learning to heal, to trust again, and Jake was right there with her. They didn't have to have everything figured out, but they were in this together. And that was enough.